In this lesson, we're going to take a look at what atmospheric perspective is and what it means in the real world, in our drawings, and of course in our character coloring and character painting. In the real world, air builds up between objects, and as they recede further and further back into the distance, there is more and more air buildup. And what this means is that foreground elements are darker, clearer, sharper, and more contrasting, and as elements move back into the distance, because of the buildup of air, their values are lighter, they have less detail, they're much less contrasting, and that means contrast between one object to another, and they overall have less detail. And so this really is what atmospheric perspective is. Now, in a sense, at your typical kind of camera angles, or rather should we say, at the typical perspectives or viewpoints that you tend to draw characters at, you won't see an incredibly large amount of atmospheric perspective because the objects, for example, an arm on the other side of the body, is pretty close to the body still. There's not a lot of air that could be built up there. But nevertheless, we use this as a tool for dramatization, right? So we're building in additional drama and an additional sense of depth and three-dimensionality into our pieces using the principles of atmospheric perspective. Now, on our drawing in the middle here, this is Gorgon, he's an orc. You may know, if you know drawing theory and line weights, that we tend to draw thicker line weights on lines that are in front and thinner line weights on lines that are behind. And as the lines get thinner and thinner, we receding those objects into the background. So it's a way for us to create depth using atmospheric perspective by ensuring foreground objects have thicker lines and background objects have thinner lines. And that is how we typically use line weights. You can see in Gorgon over here, he's got significantly thinner lines on his hair braids compared to the line of his shoulder here going into his arm. And then once again, the lines are really thick on this foreground hand here, as well as the blade, to distinguish it and create a sense of depth. Now you might say, well, there really isn't a lot of air between these things, and you just said that there's not a lot of air between these things. That is true, but remember, we are creating images. We're not creating real things, we're creating images, and we're trying to persuade the viewer of the believability of the images. So any tools we have and can use that will help to persuade the viewer is good. We also want to keep in mind that believability trumps realism, right? Believability trumps realism. If something is more believable and not really realistic, it's still more believable than it is real, right? So believability trumps realism. Now, moving on to Charlotte on the far right here. The elements in our particular sphere of interest are her rear arm here, her right arm, as well as her right leg. And both of them have lighter values compared to their foreground elements. And again, this is done to differentiate them from those objects and elements, and also to help the viewer understand that there is depth in the image. Now, it's generally a subtle effect, a fairly subtle effect, but having it in adds so much extra depth to the piece. Use it as you see fit. That is atmospheric perspective, and I'll see you in the next lesson.